Marlo Stanfield, ruthless drug lord and self-proclaimed king of West Baltimore, is a primary antagonist of both Avon Barksdale and Omar Little throughout the later seasons of The Wire. In Season 3, Marlo is introduced as an up-and-coming independent drug lord who begins annexing several Barksdale drug corners into his own territory. In an early show of force, Marlo sends some of his own crew to throw a beatdown on Bodie Brodus and his crew who had set up shop in Marlo's own territory. Marlo wished to send a clear message in violent fashion, which would become his primary means of enforcement throughout his tenure in the drug game. Soon after, Stringer Bell, second in command of the Barksdale organization, approaches Marlo to invite him to join the New Day Co-op as a way to smooth things over and also in an attempt to keep Marlo under control. Not interested in the co-op, Marlo leaves and tells his chief enforcer, Chris Partlow, to prepare to go to war against Barksdale. Around the same time, Marlo becomes the target of police investigations who originally assumed he was just another Barksdale soldier, but later find out that he is in fact independent and was actually once the target of an investigation of the possible murder of a police witness. It is then that the police confirm that Marlo is in fact officially at war with the Barksdale organization. When Avon is released from prison, Marlo unleashes multiple assaults on Barksdale territory as he views them as weak and has some success due to the failure of Barksdale soldiers to follow through on their own attacks. Marlo then changes tactics and nearly kills Avon himself in a drive-by shooting that leaves Avon wounded by gunfire. The war continues with Stanfield suffering losses as well, and it is about that time that Stringer Bell is murdered. Later, when Avon is in court, Marlo shows up to the hearing, and Avon acknowledges that Marlo is now the top dog of the Baltimore drug game. In Marlo's mind, the crown has now been passed to him. With Avon out of the picture for the time being, Marlo turns his attention to protecting and expanding his territory by violent means with Chris Partlow and Snoop Pearson. Using vacant buildings, the two dispose of countless bodies of people that got in the way of Marlo's thirst for power. Marlo then meets Michael Lee, who becomes his sort of protege after he displayed his leadership by walking away from Marlo's attempt to give Michael and his friends money for school. Later, Michael offers to join Marlo's gang after asking Marlo for help with getting rid of his abusive stepfather. While the police also step up their efforts to catch Marlo, Prop Joe also attempts to bait Marlo into a trap by orchestrating a conflict between Marlo and Omar Little, who then robs Marlo during a card game, stealing his money and his ring. While Prop Joe's intention in orchestrating the feud between Omar and Marlo was to get Marlo to see why he needed to be part of the co-op, it would backfire as Marlo eventually does join the co-op, but for more nefarious reasons. Marlo's main goal was to join the co-op in order to learn more about where the main supply for drugs in Baltimore came from so he could cut out the middleman and buy directly from the distributors, which would solidify him as the sole king of the drug trade in Baltimore. When Prop Joe takes Marlo to meet with his drug connect, Marlo learns that the supplier is a group named the Greeks and begins having Prop Joe's contact tailed so he can plan his next move in getting in touch with the Greeks on his own. Eventually, Baltimore Mayor Tommy Carcetti shuts down the Major Crimes Unit, which was responsible for monitoring Marlo's operations. As a result, Marlo takes the opportunity to step up his violence and orders attacks on multiple targets, including a hit on a dealer named Junebug and his entire family, all because he had insulted Marlo in the past. His thirst for blood also extends to Omar Little, who had since retired and left the drug game. While Chris and Snoop continue their hunt for Omar, Marlo attempts to bribe one of the Greek soldiers named Sergei with money in order to get an inside connection to the Greeks. When Marlo goes to Jessup Correctional Facility to meet with Sergei, he is instead surprised when he is greeted by Avon Barksdale himself, who is onto Marlo's plan all along. It is here that Avon states that it is he who is the one who is still in charge, and makes it clear to Marlo that if he wants to do any sort of business with the Greeks, he need to go through him first. Marlo agrees to pay Avon's sister $100,000 for the opportunity to talk to Sergei the next time he comes to visit. Soon after, Marlo meets up with the Greeks at a diner, which is a front for their drug operation. He begins to launder money with the guidance of Prop Joe while at the same time planning to overthrow him. With his money laundering scheme safe for the time being, Marlo takes advantage of an opportunity to bring Omar out of retirement and settle his score with him. He has Omar's confidant Butchie tortured and killed by Snoop and Chris, which does in fact bring Omar out to seek revenge. Marlo's laundering scheme continues to grow as he recruits former Barksdale organization attorney Maurice Levy as well, and also convinces the Greeks that they could count on him should anything happen to Prop Joe. As tensions begin to develop between different players in the co-op, primarily between Prop Joe's nephew Cheese and another drug pen named Hungry Man, Marlo seizes a chance to drive a stake into the heart of the co-op. Marlo kidnaps and delivers Hungry Man up to Cheese for him to kill in exchange for him helping to betray his uncle. Cheese delivers as promised, and Joe is executed soon after by Chris as Marlo watches. Now the sole boss of the co-op, Marlo now learns the clock code used to communicate with the Greeks, and though he's excited with his position, Chris reminds him that they still need to deal with Omar. When an ambush against Omar fails after he jumps out of a second-story building and survives, Marlo realizes that Omar's survival could cause him serious problems. At the next co-op meeting, Marlo informs the group that he was inadvertently responsible for Prop Joe's death, stating it was because he made a move on Omar that resulted in Omar killing Prop Joe in revenge. He then dissolves the co-op, appointing Cheese as the man in charge of resupply on the east side and Monk on the west side. Omar continues his streak of revenge against the Stanfield organization and declares that Marlo isn't man enough to meet with him face to face. Knowing that this would cause Marlo to lose focus on the bigger picture, Chris decides not to tell Marlo of Omar's insults. Ultimately, Marlo never gets his chance for revenge, as Omar is soon murdered by Kennard. Soon after, the police solve the clock code, and after they tail Chris to a drug resupply with the Greeks, Marlo, along with Chris, Monk, and Cheese, are arrested. While in prison, the four contemplate how the police could have broken the clock code and known about the drug resupply. Cheese suggests that Michael could have set them up. When Chris and Marlo doubt that possibility, Monk, in a moment of frustration, reveals that Michael has been disgruntled by Marlo's actions against Junebug and his family, and how he wondered about Marlo stepping to Omar on the streets. Chris shoots him an evil eye as if to tell Monk to keep his mouth shut, but it was too late. As Chris suspected, Marlo loses complete focus on what was at hand and becomes enraged that Omar had disrespected him and no one told him about it. He declares that he would step to anyone at any time. Defiantly, he shouts, "My name is my name," to remind everyone that his name means something and it is a name to be feared and respected. Levy is able to broker a deal to get Marlo out of prison, but the deal requires Chris to take responsibility for all the murders and take life without parole. In addition, Marlo is released with his case going on the Stet docket and is in essence forced into retirement. Marlo sells a drug connect with the Greeks to Slim Charles and another dealer named Fatface Rick for $10 million, telling him that he wishes to become a businessman. In the final episode, Marlo is seen at a real estate development meeting with Maurice Levy and a few other land developers and is clearly uncomfortable and out of place. He excuses himself and walks back to the streets he once ruled, where he comes across a corner dealer telling his crew a romanticized account of Omar's last stand, as Omar has now become a street legend. It is clear that Marlo's name has already been forgotten, while Omar's lives on. When Marlo confronts them and asks if they know who he is, none of them can identify him, and only after he demonstrates his ferocity do they leave. Marlo is left alone on the street, a slight smile, realizing that this is the only place he truly belonged. On the surface, Marlo is a ruthless and remorseless person, but as his story progresses throughout the show, it becomes more and more apparent that underneath the hardened mask of a criminal drug lord is a man who is extremely insecure and is really nothing more than a big fish in a small pond. Marlo saw himself as the king. He always talked about wearing the crown. To him, dominance is the same as respect and influence. Interestingly enough, though, another character on an HBO show had the same outlook, except in that case, there were people who were able to put him in his place and were not deceived by the illusion. As one man famously told him,
"Any man who must say, 'I am the king,' is no true king."
It's like Marlo was saying that to convince himself more than anything. A true king surrounds themselves with people that aren't just yes men, and that's what Marlo did. That's another reason why Michael was targeted. He wasn't just another pawn for Marlo to use like everyone else. A true king understands the difference between power and influence, dominance and respect, and a true king inspires loyalty and not fear. Marlo's power was nothing more than an illusion, for the fact that the only thing that saved him was a political game that was much bigger than the drug game on the streets. See, while Marlo types think that they're the king on the chessboard, they're really just a single piece on the checkerboard. This is a lesson that Stringer Bell learned the hard way as well. There are several key scenes which alludes to Marlo's insecurity. First, only when Michael starts to walk away after refusing the money does he approach him with contempt, asking if his money is too good for Michael. I suspect that Michael looks at him and doesn't respond because he had pegged Marlo as someone who was just projecting. When Michael stares him down, it almost seems to take Marlo back, since he wasn't normally used to being challenged. Now, some have said that Marlo was sizing up Michael, but I tend to believe that Marlo was actually a bit intimidated. Marlo hated being challenged. He showed no respect to anyone that crossed him, even in the slightest. So Michael, by rejecting the money, really was saying to Marlo that he knew he was trying to show off, and he, Michael, wasn't buying it. When Marlo actually meets with the Greeks, Sergei in particular, he is shown very little respect. Sergey openly shows his disdain for Marlo, and only when Avon gives Sergey the okay does Sergey move forward in the conversation. Later, when he meets with the Greeks again, they admonish him for bringing them dirty money, and they tell him to come back with fresh bills. Having no other options, he leaves and comes back with the clean bills and an apology that he meant no disrespect. This is the point that I believe you start to see that Marlo is a king only in his own mind. In reality, he's a pawn in a much bigger game. The bigger players don't respect him, and he is clearly out of his element when dealing with things outside of his control. Take, for instance, his trip to Antilles to check on his money. For a man who claims to be king and on top of the game, he doesn't even understand how banking works. When Marlo isn't in control, he is lost, and the only way he knows how to get back in control is to lash out against those he knows he can overpower. Even when Marlo loses in poker, he sees it as a slight against him, and instead of just moving on and cutting his losses as a normal person would do, Marlo executes a security guard despite the man just doing his job. Again, it's a constant pattern with Marlo. He loses control, he picks a weaker target, and overpowers them just so he can feel like he's still on top. The problem for Marlo is, whenever he runs into a situation he can't control or a person he can't overpower, he allows that to consume him, as he does with Omar and Avon, and even Michael. Marlo is able to maintain his power with his methods because most of the people in his way really aren't that smart or capable themselves. The key scene that really proves Marlo's crown is fake is the scene where he ends up meeting with Avon in prison. It is clear the entire scene who the true king is. As soon as Marlo sees Avon, he gets a sort of nervous smile on his face and looks around anxiously. Avon even has Marlo's entire plan figured out before Marlo even tells him. He even praises Marlo for his ambition. However, Avon doesn't ask. He tells Marlo what to do and what will happen if he does it. It's not even a demand, but more like he's giving an order. Pay up and you'll get to speak to Sergey. He knows Marlo's going to do it too because, again, Avon's got Marlo figured out. Even from prison, Avon is the king of the game, and he makes that very clear. Marlo has no choice but to submit. So, what can we learn from Marlo Stanfield? Well, Marlo is the boss that you might have had that cares more about their own ambitions than the good of the team. They're quick to throw others under the bus and retaliate against anyone who stands in their way of promotion. They really don't have a career plan, they just know they want to be in charge. He's a coworker that doesn't lift a finger to help others out unless he sees a personal benefit in it. He's a subordinate who undermines the boss in order to try to take their position. The thing about the Marlos of the workplace is that they're never satisfied with what they have. They always want more. But what makes them effective is their ability to make moves without attracting a lot of attention. Remember, at first, Marlo wasn't even on the police's radar, and then all of a sudden he went from a nobody to a major player that required a major task force to stop him. The mistake that Stringer Bell and Prop Joe made was they thought because Marlo was young, he could be controlled. They thought he was capable of being rational, but the thing is, people like Marlo are not rational people. In essence, they tried to civilize someone who wasn't capable of civility. So who is Marlo in the workplace? In order to analyze that, we need to look at him in 3 different positions: as your supervisor, your coworker, and your subordinate. Let's start with Marlo as a supervisor because this is the only place that he may display some redeeming qualities. If you're a subordinate reporting to a Marlo, as long as you don't cross them, you might be okay, just as long as you're useful to them. Marlo was fiercely protective over anything he perceived as his. For example, when Lex killed Fruit, Marlo plainly states that since Lex came at one of his, meaning Marlo's, Lex had to fall. Chris and Snoop also maintained a sort of cordial relationship with Marlo, to the point where Chris and Marlo even seemed to be friends. Ironically, one of the only times Marlo offers any praise to anyone is when he tells a young kid good work for taking care of his pigeons. When he asks Fruit why his numbers drop, he doesn't punish Fruit, he just tells him to get support and take care of his business. As a professional, I've seen examples of supervisors who the majority of the organization despises because they're jerks to everyone else, but their staff absolutely loves them. But again, they aren't being amicable because they have good intentions. The slightest infraction can cause them to turn against you, as was the case with little Kevin, the security guard, and even old face Andre, who was just being used to get revenge on Omar. I would guess that eventually Marlo wouldn't hesitate to take out Chris if he perceived him as disloyal. So, let's bring this into the real world again. How would a Marlo type be as a supervisor? Well, as a supervisor, they are highly driven and demand a lot from their team. However, it isn't unheard of that their team seems indifferent toward them and in some cases even likes them as a supervisor. You'll often hear their staff when asked about how they like their boss, "Well, they're really fair, they're so nice, I feel like they've got my back." Because they do. It's their team. Just like Marlo told Levy Chris would be loyal as long as he took care of Chris's family, and he did, and Chris willingly took life in prison with no parole for him. That's how subordinates of the Marlo boss type think of their supervisor. Most of the time, though, they're the toxic boss that step on people to get what they want. They place blame and often lash out at others when things don't go right. Like Marlo, they really don't have a long-term objective, just a plan to get into power. They have their sights on that C-suite position even though they don't really even know what that person does. They just see themselves as wearing a nice suit and driving a fancy car and being in charge of others. To them, success is defined by perception, and it's usually their own perception of themselves. As bosses, they aren't passive-aggressive as they manage through dominance, but they are manipulative as they do things behind the scenes. These bosses never get their hands dirty, choosing to get others to do the work while they take the credit, but if things don't go well, they accept none of the responsibility. In terms of a coworker, Marlo is a person who shows no interest in helping anyone else out unless they see a way to gain personally from it. Think of how Marlo was with the co-op. He had no interest in being part of the co-op despite its overall benefits. He just wanted it all for himself. So it is in the workplace. The Marlo in the workplace finds a way to skirt the system or establish alliances in order to get what they want, and then once they have it, they move on. They have no interest in the greater good or doing things for anyone else's benefit. They also hold grudges, and the slightest things can cause them to take offense. They're tough to work with because it's often their way or the highway. They take credit for things they didn't do, and because they tend to be a dominating person, others usually back down, allowing them to get away with it. As a subordinate, it's incredibly difficult to just fire someone like Marlo at work. They are often high performers and usually exceed their goals. They are often able to get others to take the fall for them so they can keep their spot. At first, they try to win people over. They portray themselves as a team player and wanting to help others. And oftentimes, they're just viewed as go-getters. Think back to Marlo with the Corner Kids and how he reacted to Michael when Michael came to him for help. In both instances, he put on an act to show like he was looking out for others, but in reality, he was just sizing up who he could use. By the time you catch on to what their real intentions are, the damage is usually done. So, what can you do if you work with a Marlo in the workplace? Well, remember, Marlo was a man that was always on the offensive and didn't know what to do with himself when he was put on the defensive or out of his comfort zone. Ideally, the best thing you can do is if you can nip it in the bud right away and just get rid of them from your organization as soon as you spot the toxic characteristics. Prop Joe and Stringer both made the mistake of trying to bring him into their circle, and it ended up backfiring on them. Watch out for someone who takes part in undermining behavior. Watch out for the meetings after meetings. The person who is always getting everyone else riled up behind the scenes but never takes part in the actual meeting. Keep your ears open for gossip about others. Marlo was great at picking up that conflict and knew how to use this to his advantage. You need to watch out for someone who seems to be indirectly involved with the drama. The thing about Marlo was he always had someone else do his dirty work. Again, nip it in the bud. Keep tabs on them. Document everything. Give clear expectations on behavior with specific consequences that will happen if those expectations are not met. Remember, just because someone is good at their job by hitting numbers or achieving goals does not mean that they are a good fit for management roles or other positions. If someone has a negative attitude or a toxic attitude, they should not be put into a position of authority, period. Do not under any circumstance give them power. There was no indication nor period of initiation where Marlo had to prove himself to Prop Joe or Stringer, yet they invited him to belong anyway. People need to prove their character before you give them your trust. One thing I learned from a boss is to always be open with a subordinate that is wildly ambitious. Back in my early career, I wanted to move up and be CEO, the top dog. But the funny part is, I didn't even really know why, I just knew I wanted to be on top. I wanted that status. Now, I wasn't toxic like Marlo, but I was definitely set on moving up the ladder no matter what. I was also high achieving and great at the technical skills of my job, but I didn't take the time to learn the soft skills like communication, conflict management, and staff development. So I was able to exceed goals, but as a leader, I was less than adequate. But what separated me from a Marlo is I was very reflective and I learned from my failures and became a strong leader. But the issue was whenever I'd bring up getting a higher job or a promotion to my boss, she would always ask me, "Why do you want that job? What is it about that job that makes you want it, and why do you think you should get it? A lot of times I never had a good answer. This was because I was still set on title, status, and respect rather than what I could bring to the table and what I could thrive at. See, Marlo never had anyone challenge him on his rise to power. He didn't have a reason to get where he wanted to, he just knew he wanted to be there. If you're supervising someone that has those tendencies, you need to challenge them. Like my boss, ask them why they want that job, why they think they should have that job. Show them what that job is, what the responsibilities it has, and what expectations they will have on them. Get them out of their comfort zone. Challenge them with tasks that will get them to see what it's like as they move up. Remember, these are the people that don't do well when they're not in control. So in a way, you're serving them a sort of piece of humble pie. Using failure as a teacher can be your biggest asset. A person that can step back and evaluate their strengths and weaknesses in this position is not a Marlo, and that person you can continue to coach and help them grow. The biggest way to tell the difference between a Marlo and a person who is just ambitious is to see how they react to adversity, how well they handle feedback, and how strong their sense of self-awareness is. Marlo neither listened to anyone, nor did he have any sense of his own limitations, nor did he handle adversity well. And once you know what you're dealing with, then you can decide how to move forward. A Marlo needs to be fired as soon as possible. They should have limited responsibilities and have very little opportunity to connect with others. Remember, people like Marlo get their power through using other people, so don't give them that opportunity. Again, do not rationalize with them. It won't work. The best way to handle a Marlo-type personality when you are not in a position to let them go or challenge them is to just take the approach that Slim Charles did and stay off their radar. Do not bring attention to yourself and let them bury themselves. You just need to outlast them, which, if you're smart, you always will. Let them leave the organization on their own if possible. When they know their game isn't going to work, they'll try to create a firestorm and make a scene, but they will leave. Their pride won't let them stay. They can go and try to do something else, but like Marlo, they'll find out really quick that they don't belong there as well. And when they realize they don't belong anywhere, they'll head back to the streets with their paper crown, dreaming of the day when they'll someday be the king.